Grace Thompson coldly watched Michael Carter, a black soldier, as he stepped into the first-class cabin. Her gaze, laced with prejudice, was a spark that set off an unforeseen chain of events. In that fleeting moment, a seemingly small action held the weight of a lifetime of assumptions and judgments. Yet, could compassion pierce through the barrier of a hardened heart when painful truths came to light? This is a story of profound transformation, a journey from disdain to humanity, proving that even the coldest hearts can learn to love. Prepare yourself for an emotional odyssey that will move you to tears and leave you reflecting deeply on the power of forgiveness. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another heartwarming tale that resonates deeply within the soul. And now, the story begins. The waiting area at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was bustling with anxious travelers on a frigid, blustery November morning. Overhead announcements cut through the low hum of conversations, reminding passengers to check their gates, mind their belongings, and confirm any last-minute flight changes. Beneath the fluorescent lights, a kaleidoscope of humanity filled the space. Families with strollers, sharply dressed businesspeople, and backpack-laden students, all converging at gate 17. The flight to Atlanta, scheduled for a 9 a.m. departure, had been delayed, much to the evident frustration of the gathered passengers. At the center of the first-class group stood Grace Thompson, a 30-something manager dressed in a tailored gray blazer and pencil skirt. Her blonde hair was clipped neatly with an elegant silver barrette, and the clicking of her black stilettos on the tile floor betrayed her mounting impatience. Her expression bore the distinct irritation of someone accustomed to snapping her fingers and having the world fall into place. Grace was en route to an eagerly anticipated management conference where she planned to dazzle her superiors and secure a coveted promotion. Skimming through a flood of urgent emails from colleagues requesting polished budgets and flawless presentations, she fought to suppress her growing anxiety. Finally, a crackling announcement invited first-class passengers to board. She exhaled a relieved sigh, eager to escape the chaotic terminal. With her designer handbag and a sleek laptop bag in hand, she briskly strode down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin offered a serene oasis of spacious seats and glasses of champagne. Settling into seat 2A, Grace stowed her bags in the overhead compartment before pretending to check her phone, her eyes darting over urgent messages flagged in her inbox. Minutes later, a tall black man with broad shoulders and a sharply pressed military uniform appeared at the entrance to the cabin. His nameplate read M. Carter. With a measured nod, he greeted Grace before gesturing to seat 2B beside her. For a fleeting moment, Grace's emerald green eyes flickered with thinly veiled annoyance. She returned his polite acknowledgement with a tight-lipped smile, her mind immediately spiraling into silent judgments. He must have gotten upgraded for free or snagged some kind of discount. I paid a premium for this seat. Her thoughts, laced with prejudice, continued to churn. Did he even pay the full fare? Discomfort settling in, Grace leaned back into the plush leather seat, fastening her seatbelt in a manner that communicated her clear intent to avoid conversation. As Michael Parker settled into his seat, he nodded politely to Grace once more, but she turned her face toward the window, avoiding his gaze. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, offering pre-departure drinks, sparkling water, orange juice, or mimosas. One of the attendants, noticing Michael's military uniform, paused and said warmly, "Thank you so much for your service, Sergeant. Please don't hesitate to let us know if there's anything you need." Grace couldn't conceal her irritation. More special treatment for soldiers. Everyone is always so quick to thank them. Her lips tightened into a thin line as she reached for her phone, feigning busyness. She had never considered herself racist, often boasting to friends that she didn't see color. Yet in moments like this, especially when her sense of entitlement or priority felt threatened, she couldn't help but quietly resent those she deemed undeserving. A short while later, with all the first-class passengers settled, the cabin door closed, and the plane began to taxi. Michael quietly reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Grace caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. It was a picture of a smiling child, likely around 8 or 9 years old, wearing a sparkling headband and holding a soccer ball. Unable to suppress her curiosity, though tinged with annoyance, Grace spoke coldly. Adorable. Is that your daughter? Michael turned toward her, surprise flickering across his face. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. That's my daughter, Emma. Grace nearly rolled her eyes at the way he called her ma'am. Though she prided herself on her professional success, she found herself irked by his demeanor. She replied curtly, then added with a faintly mocking tone. She must be proud to have a father in uniform. Are you on your way home from duty? Actually, I'm headed to Atlanta to see her, Michael responded, his tone measured. Grace, already on edge from the day's delays, felt irritated by his brief reply. His unwillingness to elaborate stirred her need to prod further. Must be nice to get upgraded by the airline. First class, right? Michael's jaw tightened slightly. I paid for this seat myself. I'm not looking for handouts, if that's what you're implying, he said, his voice calm but resolute. His words struck a chord in Grace, challenging the unspoken prejudices she had never openly acknowledged. She inhaled sharply, striving to maintain her unaffected exterior, though a sense of discomfort gnawed at her. Slipping one earbud in, she prepared to lose herself in music, determined to cut the conversation short, even as dissatisfaction simmered beneath her composed facade. Mid-flight, the cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants began serving lunch. A choice of salmon or pasta, accompanied by a side salad and warm bread. Grace ordered a glass of Chardonnay, hoping it would quell the simmering irritation she felt. Glancing at Michael, she noticed him politely decline the offer of wine when it was presented to him. As the flight attendants set Michael's tray down, they thanked him again for his service, reminding him he could select any complimentary beverage of his choice. Grace couldn't hold back any longer. She turned toward him. Don't you ever get tired of people fawning over you just because you're in uniform? She asked, her tone sharp, though even she couldn't quite explain her bitterness. Michael's brow furrowed slightly. I appreciate their kindness, but I don't ask for special treatment, he replied evenly. Really? Grace pressed. Because it seems like everyone is bending over backward to show you how grateful they are. Meanwhile, the rest of us work just as hard and don't get any upgrades. Or perks. Michael set his fork down deliberately. Ma'am, if it bothers you that much, I can pay for my meal out of pocket. It's not an issue. His voice was controlled, but Grace could sense an undercurrent of quiet hurt. She shrugged. It's not about the meal, it's the principle. Her words carried a weight of prejudice she had never fully confronted. Deep down, Grace felt an unease around publicly celebrated or recognized black men, a discomfort that chipped away at an unacknowledged sense of superiority she kept buried. Michael turned away, a flicker of sadness crossing his face, though he seemed to decide against engaging further. He took a measured breath. I'm traveling to Atlanta because my daughter is dealing with a health issue. I just want to be there for her. Grace froze for a moment, a fleeting spark of empathy surfacing, but she quickly suppressed it. Good for you, she muttered, pushing her salad around on her plate. Inwardly, she thought probably another sob story about medical bills or something. The silence between them grew heavy. Grace tried to ignore the gnawing sense of discomfort, but she couldn't fully shake it. Her eyes drifted back to the photo of Emma, her radiant smile beaming from the glossy print. For a brief moment, a pang of guilt flickered in Grace's chest, but she quickly dismissed it, telling herself, I'm just being realistic. Not everyone in uniform is a saint. As the plane descended into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, announcing the gate details and warning of rainy weather at the destination. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt, eager to leave her seat and put distance between herself and the soldier she had so coldly dismissed. She avoided Michael's gaze as she maneuvered down the aisle toward the aircraft door. As she stepped off the plane, she overheard his voice, steady yet tinged with urgency, speaking into a phone. Yes, Carter, I've arrived. I'll be at the hospital soon. His tone stirred something faint and fleeting in Grace's mind, but she quickly dismissed it. I have a major conference to focus on, she reminded herself, glancing at her watch as she entered the terminal. Inside the bustling concourse, Grace moved briskly toward the baggage claim, ignoring the cacophony of reunited families, hurried business travelers, and lost tourists squinting at signs. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. We need your updated slides tonight. Big meeting tomorrow. Where are you? She typed a quick reply, stealing a glance over her shoulder to ensure no overly well-meaning soldier was following her. At baggage claim, she immediately spotted her sleek silver suitcase. As she turned, she caught sight of Michael on the far side of the area, still on the phone. His shoulders were hunched, his posture tense, and for a brief moment, something tugged at her heart. She quickly shook her head, brushing aside any sympathy threatening to disrupt her carefully maintained detachment. He's not my responsibility. Settling into the back seat of her pre-booked car, the rhythmic drumming of heavy rain began to tap against the windshield. Harborwood Hotel, please, she instructed. The driver nodded, merging into Atlanta's infamous traffic. Leaning her head back, Grace tried to focus on the major presentation she was scheduled to deliver in less than 24 hours. She scrolled through her phone, tweaking financial figures and refining the narrative of her slides, but her concentration faltered more than usual. A quiet, persistent voice in her mind replayed snippets of her brief exchange with Michael. The flash of pain in his eyes, his words about his daughter's medical struggles. No, she whispered to herself. I'm not letting this derail me. Soldiers come home with sad stories all the time. Life's tough for everyone, right? The next morning, Grace's conference took place in a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The event hall buzzed with discussions about cutting-edge market strategies, modern leadership theories, and murmurs about potential corporate mergers. Grace navigated the crowd confidently, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, and setting up her laptop for her keynote presentation. She thrived on the adrenaline of corporate success, each handshake reinforcing her sense of power. Her presentation, polished slides, precise data, and a carefully calculated touch of humor, was met with nods of approval and congratulatory smiles. As her phone chimed with a notification, Grace stepped out into the quiet hallway to check it. A local news app alert popped onto her screen. Local Army sergeant's daughter fighting for her life. Community calls for support. The thumbnail image showed a hospital room. Normally, Grace would have swiped past a headline like that without a second thought. But this time, she hesitated. And then she clicked. Sergeant Michael Parker, recently returned from overseas duty, is appealing for help for his daughter, Emma, who has been diagnosed with a life-threatening congenital heart defect. Grace stared at her screen, her stomach twisting in knots. The article included a photo, Emma's smiling face from the picture Michael had shown her. But now, the image depicted the little girl lying in an ICU bed, her small frame covered in tubes and wires. The caption read, Emma Carter, 9, awaits a specialized surgery not fully covered by standard military insurance. Phrases like experimental procedure and insurance gaps leapt off the screen, striking Grace with an unexpected force. She read the article slowly, each line amplifying the heavy weight of guilt pressing on her chest. The piece detailed how Michael Parker had rushed back to the U.S. due to Emma's deteriorating condition. She needed a complex medical intervention at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, an extraordinarily expensive procedure that had forced Michael to launch an online fundraiser. Grace's pulse quickened. The biting remarks she had hurled at Michael on the plane replayed in her mind like a haunting echo. She remembered Emma's small, radiant smile, now juxtaposed with tubes and monitors, and the weary, drawn look on Michael's face. He hadn't been pretending. She could see that clearly now. A wave of remorse washed over her, tightening her chest. She locked her phone screen, attempting to dismiss the article as just another sad story unrelated to her life. But Emma's image lingered in her thoughts, breaking through the walls of certainty she had always clung to. For the first time in years, Grace felt a flicker of genuine remorse pierce the guarded heart she had worked so hard to fortify. That evening, the conference transitioned to a cocktail reception. Laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the hum of career-centric conversations filled the room. Dressed in a sleek black gown, Grace maintained her signature confident smile, mingling with a circle of executives. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to immerse herself in discussions of profit margins and quarterly plans, Emma's innocent, hopeful face dominated her thoughts. She sipped her champagne, forcing a polite laugh at a joke, but the weight of guilt hung over her like an oppressive shadow. Finally, unable to shake the unease, she retreated to a quiet corner near a large window, gazing out at Atlanta's glittering city lights. For the first time, the dazzling view failed to stir its usual allure. Grace pulled out her phone and reopened the article, this time clicking on the link to Michael Parker's fundraiser. Goal: $150,000. Raised: $37,000. The page displayed updates from Michael and messages of encouragement from donors. Contributions ranged from $10 to $100, each accompanied by heartfelt notes wishing Emma a speedy recovery. Her chest tightened. With her salary and investments, Grace was far from struggling financially. Yet, the thought of giving a significant sum to a stranger was foreign to her. She had always believed that hard work and perseverance were the keys to obtaining what one needed, just as she had done. But as she stared at the fundraiser, the words from the article, the image of Emma in the hospital, and Michael's exhausted face all swirled together in her mind. For once, her pragmatic justifications felt hollow. As Grace read Michael's heartfelt explanation about the gaps in insurance coverage for Emma's specialized heart surgery, her perspective began to shift. She typed a number into the donation box but hesitated. Am I really going to do this? The thought of parting with such a significant amount made her waver. But the memory of her sharp, callous remarks on the plane haunted her, urging her forward. Slowly, she entered $10,000. Her heart pounded as she pressed submit. A confirmation screen immediately appeared, thanking her for her generous contribution. She stared at the words, wondering if Michael would recognize her name, Grace Thompson, the woman who had been so unkind to him. For a moment, she wished she could have donated anonymously, but in her haste, she'd forgotten to select that option. Setting her phone aside, Grace pressed her fingers to her temples. She knew that money, no matter how large the amount, was merely a band-aid over a far deeper wound. I owe them more than just money, she admitted to herself. I owe them an apology. The following morning, Grace woke before dawn, her mind restless from a night of fitful sleep. Leaving a note for her conference team explaining she'd be occupied with personal matters for a few hours, she drove her rental car to Peachtree Children's Hospital, a sprawling campus adorned with colorful murals of animals and bright, welcoming signage. An unfamiliar nervousness gripped her as she stepped onto the third floor, where the pediatric cardiology unit was located. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors created a solemn soundtrack. Nurses in scrubs bustled past, some exchanging weary but kind smiles. Grace approached the central desk. I'm here to see Emma Carter, she said softly, her voice feeling foreign in her throat. The nurse at the monitor glanced up. Are you family? Grace flushed. No, I'm a friend of the family. The words felt hollow even to her. The nurse raised an eyebrow but picked up the phone to verify with Emma's father. After a brief conversation, she pointed toward a hallway decorated with cheerful cartoon murals. At room 312, Grace peered through the glass window. She saw Michael Parker standing beside a metal-framed hospital bed, leaning over Emma's small body, which was covered in tubes and connected to monitors. His broad back seemed to carry the weight of the world, rigid with the burden of overwhelming responsibility. Summoning her courage, Grace knocked gently on the doorframe. Michael turned, his eyes widening in surprise. Ms. Thompson? He said, his voice a mixture of confusion and caution. I didn't expect to see you here. Her heart pounding, Grace stepped inside. The small room held a few stuffed animals on a table, and 4 stand administering medication, and a monitor emitting steady beeps. Emma lay still, her chest rising and falling softly, an oxygen tube taped below her nose. I read about Emma's situation in the news, Grace began, her voice trembling. I'm sorry if this feels intrusive, but I wanted to check on her. And on you, she said, her tone low, almost confessing. Michael's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. But instead of anger, Grace saw profound sadness in his eyes. Gently, he brushed a hand over Emma's tiny fingers. She's in critical condition, he said quietly. The doctors say the specialized surgery is her best hope. Grace moved closer to the bed, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. I'm so sorry, she whispered, feeling tears welling at the corners of her eyes. Emma stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked twice, struggling to focus on Grace's face. Michael leaned in close, his voice gentle and soothing. Sweetheart, someone's here to see you. Emma gave a faint nod. Grace attempted a warm smile, though she couldn't help but notice the exhaustion in Emma's eyes and the sheen of sweat on her forehead. Slowly, Grace extended her hand, her voice soft. Hi, Emma. I'm Grace. I met your dad on a flight a few days ago. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Are you here for work too? Grace swallowed hard, her throat tightening. Yes, I came here for a conference. But I wanted to visit you. Your dad told me how brave you are. A faint smile touched Emma's lips. I'm trying, but I'm always so tired, she said, her eyes drifting to the machines beside her, their rhythmic beeping filling the room. But I'll get better. Emotion swelled in Grace's chest. The resilience in Emma's voice touched something deep within her, breaking through the rigid walls she had built around her biases. She glanced at Michael, who gently wiped Emma's forehead with a cloth. As Emma drifted back to sleep, Michael turned to Grace. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. But I have to admit, I'm curious. What made you change your mind? Grace felt her cheeks flush with shame. I read the article about you and Emma, she began, and I couldn't stop thinking about how awful I was on the plane. I realized my actions. She hesitated, searching for the right words, were hurtful and rooted in ignorance. Michael's gaze remained steady, cautious. You were harsh, he said, his voice measured. And that was your choice. But I won't deny it stung. It's hard to be dismissed by someone who doesn't know you, especially because I'm a black soldier. Grace's throat tightened. I know, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, but I made a donation to Emma's fund. I want to start making amends. I know money can't fix everything, but I had to do something. Michael studied her for a moment, his expression contemplative. Finally, he nodded slightly. I appreciate that, he said, but Emma's life isn't something you can fix with a check. I fight for her every day. Still, I can see that you're trying, and that does mean something. Grace lowered her head, his words echoing in her mind. He was right. She couldn't undo her cruelty in a single act of generosity. True change would require sustained effort. In the days that followed, Grace found herself increasingly drawn into Emma's story. Despite her commitments at the conference, she made time to visit the hospital. Bringing coloring books, children's stories, or small stuffed animals, Grace worked to distract Emma with funny anecdotes or memories from her own childhood. Gradually, Emma grew more comfortable around her. Meanwhile, Grace discovered that her initial donation had sparked significant interest. Contributions to the fundraiser surged as some of her corporate colleagues also began donating, creating a ripple effect. While she was pleased with the growing funds, Grace soon realized that Michael needed logistical help as well, navigating insurance claims, managing the hospital's intricate paperwork, and coordinating second opinions from medical specialists. She offered to assist, though Michael hesitated at first. You don't need to sacrifice your time for us, he said, his fingers brushing over a wedding ring strung on a chain around his neck. But if you truly want to help, I won't refuse. Grace threw herself into the task with the same organizational fervor she once reserved for corporate projects. She learned that Emma's best chance lay with a highly specialized surgeon experienced in rare congenital defects. But the wait list for that surgeon was heartbreakingly long. On a bright afternoon, Grace stepped out of the main entrance of the hospital, Her phone pressed to her ear as she made a call to a contact in the specialized medical approval department. In the past, she had used these connections purely for personal gain. But now, she felt a burning need to help Emma, not out of guilt, but because she genuinely cared. Amid her calls, a colleague from the conference texted, "You missed the afternoon session. Everything okay?" Grace replied briefly, "I'm helping someone who needs me." For the first time in years, she turned her back on the relentless pursuit of career advancement. Yet strangely, the decision felt undeniably right. That evening, as she prepared to leave the hospital, Grace encountered Michael in the hallway. He looked exhausted but managed a faint smile. "Emma had a tough afternoon," he said, pausing to meet her gaze. "But she's stable now." Michael hesitated, studying her face. "I see you running around, making calls and putting your work aside for us. Why are you doing this?" Grace took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Because I realized that you deserve it. And so does Emma," she said softly. "Not because you're a soldier or because I feel guilty, but because you and your daughter are people worth helping." The day of the surgery arrived, filled with both anxious anticipation and fragile hope. Grace stood alongside Michael in the hallway as nurses prepped Emma in the pediatric surgical unit. They said their goodbyes at the double doors leading to the operating room. Emma clutched the small teddy bear Grace had given her, her brave smile faltering only slightly as her teary eyes glistened. Grace felt her throat tighten when she heard Emma's gentle voice. "I'll be okay, Daddy." Miss Grace said, "I'm strong." Hours passed in the family waiting room, where the tension was almost palpable. Michael repeatedly clasped and unclasped his hands, pacing the room at intervals. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the clock on the wall, silently praying. She had never been particularly religious, but at that moment, she was willing to pray to any higher power that could help Emma pull through. Finally, the surgeon appeared, his expression tired but tinged with relief. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "We've repaired the defect. While she'll need close monitoring, the prognosis is very optimistic." Collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Michael buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as quiet sobs of gratitude overcame him. Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks, her emotions a mixture of profound relief and admiration. Overwhelmed, she lightly touched Michael's arm. He looked up, his tear-streaked face full of raw emotion, and without hesitation, pulled her into a brief but heartfelt hug. In the days that followed, Emma's recovery was like a roller coaster. Managing pain, undergoing scans, and attending physical therapy. Grace visited often, sometimes bringing healthy snacks or new pajamas. She sat by Emma's bedside, reading stories whenever Michael stepped out for coffee or consultations with the medical team. As Emma's health improved, she began jokingly calling Grace her coolest older friend ever. That simple nickname warmed Grace's heart in a way no professional award or recognition ever had. Emma's story continued to gain attention, moving from local media outlets to national programs that spotlighted the gaps in healthcare coverage for military families. During one brief interview, Grace stood beside Michael, recounting the wave of donations and the fight to secure the best care for Emma. Some speculated about a romantic relationship between them, but the truth was far more profound. They had learned to respect and care for one another, forging a bond that transcended the painful beginning of their shared journey on that flight. Grace's transformation didn't end at the hospital doors. She began confronting the deeply ingrained biases she'd carried for years. Seeking professional counseling, she delved into the prejudices formed during her upbringing in an affluent, predominantly white community, where subtle prejudices had been quietly passed down through her family. She recognized how those views had shaped her perspective, including her reaction to Michael on the plane. Though the process was difficult, she was committed to unlearning those beliefs and ensuring she never hurt anyone in the same way again. Emma's health steadily improved. A milestone came when her cardiologist announced that she was ready for partial discharge. On the day Emma left the hospital, she wore sparkling new sneakers that lit up with every step. She threw her arms around Grace in a hug filled with pure, childlike sincerity. "Thank you for helping me, Miss Grace. I hope you'll still visit me, even when I'm not in the hospital anymore. Grace's throat tightened. I promise I'll visit, she whispered, fighting back tears. Michael helped Emma into a wheelchair to complete the discharge paperwork. Then he turned to Grace, his deep voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done. I know it started with a donation, but you went so far beyond that. You were here fighting alongside me. I'll never forget it. Grace looked at him, recalling the man she had once scorned on the plane. She offered a trembling smile. Just let me stay in Emma's life. That's more than enough to repay me. The next month felt like stepping out of the shadows. Emma adjusted to her new medication regimen and began rediscovering the small joys of childhood. Reading books, drawing pictures, and even taking short walks in the park, with Michael gently pushing her wheelchair. Grace remained a constant presence, often organizing meals, delivering groceries, or simply stopping by to talk. The career that had once defined her now seemed less significant compared to what she had been able to do for Emma's life. While she continued working, she approached her role with a newfound perspective. She proposed philanthropic initiatives within her company, arguing that their resources could support children with critical medical needs. Her enthusiasm struck a chord with leadership, who invited her to head the company's corporate social responsibility program, something she had never envisioned for herself before meeting Michael and Emma. One cool autumn evening, about 3 months after Emma's surgery, Grace was invited to a small barbecue at Michael's aunt's house in the suburbs of Atlanta. It was a modest home with a spacious backyard, where Emma laughed and played with her cousins, occasionally pausing to catch her breath, mindful of her still recovering heart. Michael's extended family welcomed Grace warmly. She was the only white person there, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider. Sitting at a picnic table, nibbling on potato salad, Grace watched as Michael showed Emma how to throw a softball. Emma gave it a try, but the ball wobbled, causing her to burst into laughter, her hand resting lightly on her chest, careful of her surgical scar. Michael gently adjusted her arm, and this time, the ball flew a little farther. The sound of their laughter echoed across the yard. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of charcoal smoke and freshly cut grass. She thought back to how it all began. The harsh words exchanged on the flight, the biases she had projected onto a black soldier sitting in first class, and the hurtful assumptions she had made. If I hadn't boarded that flight, if I hadn't read that article. She began to think, but stopped herself. Whatever it was, fate, coincidence, or divine intervention, it had forced her to confront the darkest parts of herself while also offering her a chance to grow. As the evening sky darkened and fireflies danced in the warm air, Emma nestled beside Grace. "Will you read me a story?" the little girl asked, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Of course," Grace replied, pulling a slim fairy tale book from her bag. She had found it at a small local bookstore, and now, under the soft glow of the porch light, she began to read. Her voice wove tales of brave princesses and loyal knights, painting a magical world for Emma, who listened intently, her head resting against Grace's arm. Nearby, Michael stood with his arms crossed, glancing over occasionally to ensure Emma was still comfortable. He caught Grace's gaze and mouthed a silent thank you. In that moment, Grace felt the last remnants of her old self, defined by ambition and hardened by prejudice, dissolve. She understood the profound depth of this new bond. A soldier who had risked his life for others, a young girl who refused to succumb to illness, and a woman who had confronted her own biases to discover the true meaning of compassion. In the years that followed, Emma continued her slow but steady recovery, each checkup bringing better news than the last. Grace balanced her corporate work, now deeply intertwined with philanthropic initiatives, with volunteering for organizations supporting military families and children requiring specialized care. She became a vocal advocate for equity, determined not only to confront her personal biases but to address broader societal issues that left people like Michael Parker struggling for assistance. The guilt that had once consumed her gradually transformed into a quiet yet steadfast drive to do better, for Michael, for Emma, and for countless others she might never meet. While she could not erase the harsh words she had spoken on the plane, She hoped her actions over time would speak louder. Michael, Emma, and Grace grew into a family, not in the traditional sense, but one bound by gratitude and a shared decision to weather life's storms together. What had begun as an overloaded flight and a meeting clouded by prejudice and disdain became the foundation for a story of redemption, compassion, and shared humanity. It stood as a testament to the idea that even our worst impulses can be overcome by the simplest truths: empathy, sincerity, and a willingness to change. This story is a testament to the idea that even our worst impulses can be overcome through simple truths: empathy, sincerity, and a willingness to change. It reminds us that compassion and understanding have the power to transform everything, even the deepest prejudices. If you were in Grace's position, would you have the courage to confront your mistakes and make amends? Have you ever helped someone navigate through a significant challenge in their life? Share your story in the comments. Your words could become a powerful source of inspiration for others. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of kindness and forgiveness. Thank you for watching and supporting. Together, let's build a better world, one small but meaningful step at a time. Wishing you happiness and peace always.